Now,
you were saying.
So, what the fuck was it? Oh, Star Trek. One of the things, yes, we shall discuss the booze. One of the things that drove Star Trek would be things like nanotechnology. So if you get into, they talk about it a little bit in TNG, here and there, but they play with it a ton in Star Trek Voyager, with the Borg and all of that type of stuff. Actually, TNG introduced the Borg, so it's right there. And, they're essentially space zombies, right? But they do it with this idea of nanotechnology, and they really delve into the idea of what does it mean if you could have little machines, microscopic machines, that could fix your cells. Would you kind of be immortal? And they go, the science fiction part of this is taking something real world and then playing with the idea of how does that change humanity.
And there's an underlying idea of the Borg collective. In other words, there is a reason why they are going after people, and that is to add something to add them to the Borg collective. In other words, I guess the Borg feel that they're going to be better off assimilated.
Well, they're the Zerg, or which this happened far before the Zerg. Not far before the Zerg, but pretty close. Before it. Actually, well before it. What am I thinking? This was like 1989, 1990. They're space zombies, all that good stuff. But it's this idea of, okay, we want to be better. We want cybernetics to make us better, to evolve, to force evolution. And then where does that eventually go? To force efficiency, and eventually you become space zombies. The Borg are not evil. They're doing what they do. And if you get into the actual sort of lore that's there on the Borg, they started out very much like us. And that's a theme within Star Trek, with the Q continuum.
I really like the Q.
With a ton of these races that have advanced in ridiculous ways, to the point where we think they're gods almost. A lot of them, and I mean like a lot of them, started out like humans. And that, if you look at TNG, that's even one of the major plays behind the entire series. This optimism of humanity that we will eventually become something amazing. You get that Interstellar, blah, 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 blah. Star Trek, when you watch the show, if you were to play a Star Trek tabletop RPG, which I am about to run in DreadLore, once I can get my players to do it, it has an element of simulationism, because you need to make sure you're following the rules of Star Trek. You need to have Star Trek-y type things. You're playing a Star Wars game. You got to play Star Wars. The things you expect in Star Wars need to be there. But you don't have to be simulationists. You do have to know what the world is. You got to know the rules of the world. And that all deals about world building. And if you're starting from scratch, great. But no one really starts from scratch. People allow J.R. Tolkien as designing essentially what everyone bases all fantasy off of. What are elves, what are dwarves, what are hobbits or halflings, if you will.
They all had precedence in existing lore.
Yeah, Tolkien did not make that shit up. I mean, he made up a ton of stuff. I'm not trying to say he didn't make up
even
stuff.
Some of the stuff that he did with, say, the writing system and languages had some precedent.
Oh yeah, well he took from all these different things that he knew, and he attacked the world with this idea of language and how, because he was a linguist, that's what he was.
Yeah, and
linguist and a historian, and I've heard it argued or said that the reason Tolkien wrote The Hobbit, this children's story, is because England at that time, in the teens, 20s, etc., didn't really have any folklore of their own. You had the Germans; they had tons of folklore. You had the Swedes, the Norse. All these people had tons of folklore. The Arabs, Egyptians. But the English, they really didn't have any. they didn't have any of the princesses and the princes and the weird shit. So Tolkien wanted to write an English folklore. And so he made these very different takes on races. And he pulled from this ancient folklore that everybody knew. Something that I found was really, really an interesting find for me, who's someone who, obviously I write stories, I play games, I'm making DreadLore and songs about it and everything. There's a letter where Tolkien is bitching about how, and trying to defend his folklore. And what he's defending it against is people saying things like, well, that's not what an elf is. Elves, they don't look like that. They don't have pointy ears. They're not tall, because, by the way, Tolkien elves are like 6.5 feet tall, or they're supposed to be. You don't really get that in the movie, but like Aragorn, he's 6.5 feet tall. And you might ask, well, he's a human. Is he though? Is he though? He's a Dunedain, which means he's got part Maya, which is like kind of what Gandalf is, like a demigod, and he has full elven blood in him from Elrond's line. Regardless, my point is, Tolkien even had to, and he was lamenting that people just were not accepting his lore because they kept on looking at the folklore they knew and just resisting what Tolkien was trying to do. And then, 100 years later, kind of really, when someone's like, oh, what's an elf? And you look at them, they're really fucking pretty people with huge fucking pointed ears and all this shit. Side note, Tolkien elves did not have pointed ears.
I did not know.
Nope. They did have, there is a letter where, and mind you, we'll get into that. There's a letter where he compares their ears to human ears. And he says they are more leaf-shaped. He does not say they're pointed. What he does say is a human child and an elven child could easily be confused.
So did someone else actually take artistic license to make elves that way?
Yeah, if you watch the animated series, Tolkien pulled a lot of inspiration from mythologies. Yeah. If you look at actually Cameron's been studying a bunch of folklore. He knew a lot about it before, but he's been studying a ton of it lately. If you look at the animated series of The Hobbit, which you should watch because it's fucking awesome, The Lord of the Rings, they use a lot of this like cell shading, like live action almost thing.
When was it made?
Oh, the 70s, I'm pretty sure. It's forever ago. The music's awesome. Because, if you're reading the books, music's everywhere. And so music's everywhere. Like, they just break out in the song, Frodo of the Nine Fingers. Anyway, in The Hobbit, when you see the Wood Elves, just watch The Hobbit, as in the animated, like 1970s-ish version of it. And rotoscoping, that's what it is. Yeah, it wasn't very good. And you'll see what people thought the elves were. And it'll blow your mind. I'm pretty sure they have leaves for leaves for ears. Pretty sure. They may not. And then you see Elrond, who is a gray elf, right? Pretty sure. And the way he looks. They do not look human at all. But if you read the books, nowhere is it like, they look like monsters. They don't. And in fact, Tolkien even said this. Whatever.
This is all new to me because I don't really.
Well, it's in the Silmarillion, and a lot of people don't know that the Silmarillion was, yes, it was written by Tolkien, but he didn't compile it. His son did after his death.
So it was posthumously.
Oh yeah, and a lot of it was written after the fact. He retconned the fuck out of it. One of the coolest things about Tolkien, though, as opposed to someone like, George Lucas, is Tolkien straight up admitted it. He was like, oh yeah, I initially wrote that there's just a ton of wizards. And they're just wizards. Like Gandalf in The Hobbit, he's a wizard. He's not a Maiar or an Ishtari, the Order of the Wizard. He's not that. He is not a demigod. He's not a Lauren from, the Undying Lands. That's not what's going on. He's just a fucking wizard. Only later did he tie in these things. And that's why when Bilbo gets the ring, it's just a magic ring. Right?
Yeah.
Now, it's based off a Socratic didactic, which I forget the name of. And it's where they're talking about virtue. Like Glaucon or Hippocrates or whatever the fuck his name was. Pretty much throws down on Socrates and says, listen, it's better to be a shitbag than it is to be virtuous. And the reason, his whole example, which is pretty awesome, I forget the name of the ring he uses. This is where the one ring, like kind of the story comes from. He says, imagine you have a ring, and if you put it on, you can turn invisible, right? Well, you can do anything you want. And anyone, once they put on that ring, it doesn't matter how virtuous they are, eventually they will be corrupted and become a shitbag. He goes on to say things like, I won't get into it. You can read it, goddammit. But he goes on to say things like, if you're someone who is truly full of vice and really, really good at that, then everyone's going to think you're virtuous because you're going to be very good at lying.
Well,
and a virtuous person will never claim the virtue they do. So people will probably not give them money because they're not going to be rich. Which is better. That's the whole.
This brings a thought to mind. Did anyone ever take the corollary example of what happens if you take a horrible person and you deprive them of their ability to be horrible? If there was some sort of magic way to do that, would they eventually become virtuous?
We have to define what virtuous is.
Right.
And you'd have to define what morality is. Jonathan Haidt, whether you disagree or agree with him, it's very interesting if you read that book. There's a bunch of YouTube of him blabbing on and stuff.
There's this obscure BBC sci-fi series called Red Dwarf that was on.
I've heard of that.
That was on the air, and it's a funny.
Plato, Socrates.
It's a really funny series. What happened? But there's one episode where one of the members of the crew of the spaceship that they're on gets sent to a rehabilitation zone or a rehabilitation ship, and the way they rehabilitate you, it's this sci-fi almost magical area where you go in to this area, and whatever you try and do to someone else, it just does to you. So, like, every time you try and hit someone, you just get hit in the back of the head. If you try and set something on fire, your back will be on fire. Well, and so
it's like Pavlov's dog style.
Well, the theory is they stick you in that area long enough, and after a while, it's thought that the idea of treating someone right, or at least not hurting them, would become second nature, and you'd be ready to go. You'd be ready to go back out into. It's just one episode, but it's an interesting series. Red Dwarf. It's kind of a parody of Star Trek, to be honest. In fact, it is.
This is one of the things that Cameron was saying to do to Google. Oh, sorry, I just covered up your face. To Google search Thranduil. Yeah, so that's the 1977 version of him.
Oh.
Right? He's supposed to be a wood elf. And if I go back, this is Elrond. Oh, he's talking.
Looks like a GIF.
Yeah, it's a GIF.
GIF.
Anyway, yeah. Boop. Ari, teaching compassion. Yeah. Boop. Right. So, yeah, back to world building. We went off a little bit there. So one of the ideas for DreadLore, I was drawing out the maps, and I wanted I approach things from more of an artistic perspective. But I also, when I think of stories, I try to incorporate places that I've been. Not just places that I've seen like on movies and shit, because you get real derivative after a while. For example, in DreadLore, there's a city called the Bonestone City. It's the seat of the Calgarian Empire, Empress or Emperor. And the way that it can be described is it's as big as Mega City 1, eventually, from Judge Dredd. And imagine like the floating islands of Avatar, the blue cat people movie, right? All of that's very derivative. But the Bonestone City in a lot of ways was influenced by those things, right? What I did not want to do, so I think that's fine to do, pull from your resources, from places that aren't really around. It also was derived from Mark Twain, the wild or the great adventures of Mark Twain. Have you ever seen this?
No, I haven't.
It's like this stop animation, stop motion.
Wait, was that?
It will blow your fucking mind.
No, I have seen some of that. I remember. Was it a claymation?
Claymation.
Yeah.
And you see the devil?
Yes, I do. I remember that vividly.
Dude.
And I remember seeing that as a kid.
It is so cool. And it's a kid's show, but it's creepy as fuck.
It's one of the best things. It's one of the best things I saw as a kid, because it was very theological.
Yeah. Yeah.
Very controversial.
Yeah. Cameron's into it.
Yeah.
Also, if you haven't seen Fantastic Planet, you need to watch it in French with the subtitles, which it's called, fuck. I can't, it's called like The Savage, like Planète Sauvage or something like that. But look up Fantastic Planet. You can get it on YouTube. You can definitely stream it for free. It will just deal with it for like 20 minutes and it'll suck you in. Will blow up your goddamn brain with philosophy. Anyway, world building. So I think it's perfectly fine to pull from all these different sources, even tropey sources. It's cool to have the floating island city, right? But you got to make it your own. And I do feel like we did. Because one of the things that Daniel was saying after I'd kind of shown in the map, and Cameron had played in a ton of my games, ran in D&D. Facilitated in D&D. And where I was building this sort of setting. And when we created DreadLore, that was the setting, and I just built it out. We wanted to make this pantheon. It's very built upon what's it called? The Sandman series, as well as Planescape, as well as Norse mythology. Those three really combine into it. Maybe a little bit of the Egyptian. The idea of mythologies about where everything came from. Ben really loves the idea of, and I'm just going to put words in his mouth, but he can defend himself when he's here. He likes the idea of knowing, well, where did everything come from? What actually happened. But I don't like that. I like the idea of, the gods keep their own secrets, right? Maybe the gods didn't even make everything. Like, there's these myths, and because of those myths, people, or Dena and Denashia, the people of the world, the progeny and whatnot, and these paragon races, they believe certain truths. And that facilitates and almost like a self-fulfilling prophecy, what and why they do things.
And that also brings up a point, and that is that characters in your world don't always have to have it right. In other words, there could be some aspect of that.
And usually don't.
Yeah. There's a lot of stuff that we did not have right until we learned otherwise.
Right.
Even as recently as say, the 1980s, there were some people who doubted continental drift, just to give you an example. But what your world is and what the main characters believe.
That's a theme of Star Trek. Just to get back to it a little bit, that's actually a huge theme, especially in the early seasons of Next Generation of TNG, of them going to lesser developed worlds and, the world dealing with a crisis or dealing with a world-changing event, and the denizens of that place being unwilling to accept it for certain reasons, which obviously applies to politics and all these things, but we're going to avoid that situation. World building. It doesn't just have to do with terrain. It has to do with beliefs, but a lot of times those beliefs are because of terrain, right? So why does everyone have like a fucking sun god?
Sun is, well, if you don't understand what the sun is, it's you might make assumptions about it.
Yeah, I mean, like
you probably know enough to realize that it's good to have the sun.
It's that idea that we live right now in a time where we can stay inside all the time, right? We don't have to farm necessarily. At least in many countries, you don't have to. But back in the day, they did. And so everyone knew what the sun was. I haven't seen the sun in like 3 weeks.
Which would be the case if your world was set in a polar forest.
Right. And so the rules are different, right? The sun, you can see it. There's a whole George Carlin skit about worshiping the sun. If you haven't seen it, you should watch it. You can see it. It's hot. When it comes up, you can actually fucking see. The sun is a big deal. The moon, huge deal. Sometimes it's there, sometimes it's not. And when it's there and you're in an island nation, you know it, right? So all of these seasons, all of these things, it's all tied. It's very easy when world building to just make this up arbitrarily and be like, oh yes, there's the such and such festival and the moon's out and no one else in this territory for hundreds of miles knows anything about this. It doesn't really make sense. What makes sense, what has a polarity, I think there's a pun there as well, is when the moon, for instance, in DreadLore, there's 3 moons. Actually, there's 2 moons, and one of them is a white dwarf star. But people don't know that, because why the fuck would they know that, right? This is actually a story that Cameron came up with. One of the moons is called Ariane. One is called Name. Ariane is a female type character. Name is a male type character. They don't have to be, but this particular story, they are. There are, in the South, there's an Amazonian kind of matriarchal society called the Norholkians. So imagine Spartans, but they're chicks. And they live on this sort of Mongolian steppe. Think of like the Dothraki Sea. That's the easiest way to say it.
Which were, I think, probably inspired by Mongolians.
Really? Well, actually, that makes sense. They're in horses. They're a Dothraki horde. Right. So the Norholkians would probably call Ariane and Name, because everybody sees these 2 moons. One is bright purple, one is bright blue, one is larger than the other. The Norholkians probably have a mythology that it's 2 female lovers. Because there's a matriarchal society, they don't, they think about things differently. So the truth of it doesn't matter. The idea, though, is they're explaining maybe why what is happening, but more so morality from it, right? And that story, you can read if you ever ask me, or you ask Cameron. It has to do with unrequited love. And then you have Hester, which is that white dwarf star, far away, way up there. And when Hester comes around, it's considered good luck. And the reason for that is because the seasons tend to change to be more favorable. Why? I know, because it's a fucking white dwarf star and it's got gravity. Right? Now, do I have to be a fucking astrophysicist to know that? No. You can play with the fantasy, but I know if Hester's in the sky, there's a wealth of ideas to deal with there. you start getting to this idea of, is there a track that it always follows? Okay, well, then you're going to have certain kingdoms that act a certain way. Or is it erratic? And, maybe it's bad luck or whatever. Setting up those foundations, by doing that, you pretty much set up, you till the soil, if you will. This is tilling.
You have a scaffold.
This is tilling the soil. This is tilling the soil. You want to do it this way.
You have narrative scaffolding.
You have narrative scaffolding. Coined by Hulker. It's good shit.